right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Morbid Symptoms podcast. I'm your host, Tara Van Dyke, and I'm joined again by Garrett, aka the Social Populist. How are you doing?
How's it going?
Pretty good, hanging in there. How's my audio? Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, good. Just want to make sure. All right, so we are going to do, this is our bad anarcho-capitalist takes. Our first version, but I think it'll be the first of many, from what I gather. Anyhow, Garrett recently published an article in, let me bring it up here, in Covert Action on who is Antony Sutton. And I have to say that I had not heard that person's name before. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with who was Antony Sutton and why should we care? And in particular, his influence around both American populism and particularly the libertarian movements, which of course, anarcho-capitalism. I don't know if it's a synonym. Is anarcho-capitalism a synonym for libertarian or is it an offshoot?
That's a good question, actually. I would say I guess it is a sub genre of libertarianism.
Okay.
But I do feel like the pioneering libertarian capitalist thinkers were very anarchist oriented, like Murray Rothbard. Sutton doesn't say anything explicitly anarchist, but in the dedication of Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, he dedicates it to the Green movement, who are the people who are neither the Reds, the communists, or the Whites, who are the anti-communists. There's this Green movement that is sometimes claimed by capitalists, but actually largely consists of anarchists. Largely consists of anarcho-communists like Nestor Makhno in the Ukraine. But Sutton doesn't talk about that part.
Okay,
the Green movement was largely composed of people who are also anti-capitalist.
Okay, well, so hopefully by the end...
are the Librithian contradictions of the libertarian capitalist movement.
Well, and speaking of contradictions, we're going to the first part of our show tonight is going to be focusing on Antony Sutton, and again, we're not going to go through all the nitty gritty of Garrett's article, but it is available. It's not behind a paywall or anything, so I'd encourage people to go look at that because he really does a deep dive, and it's very a very historical factual account, which is nice. But what we're going to kind of get on the theme is just the overall theme is kind of looking at libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism or its various offshoots as a morbid symptom. So a symptom of a dying capitalist order where how the saying goes, the old is dying, but the new has yet to take root. So this is a time of a lot of morbid symptoms. However, also because Antony Sutton isn't just a fun historical story. It seems that his influence is still with us. So we're going to get to that. And then we'll probably take a little pause for the cause. And I'll check in on Garrett, how he's doing. And then we will come back and we will turn and focus on Thaddeus Russell. Let's see if I have his thing on here. Yes, he is, he's an actually what do I want to say? I think he is an anti-imperialist anarcho-capitalist, which to me is a contradiction in terms, because if you're anti-imperialist but pro-capitalist, anarcho-capitalist, I don't see how that. I think that's kind of an interesting thing. But anyway, we're going to talk about. He's made some comments about equating Trotsky and Stalin and Lenin all together. And he's made some, what I would call hasty generalizations and false equivalences, and a series of what would, if you were in an elements of argument class, would get you a grade deduction. And we're gonna have a bit of fun with that. And that's part 2. So first we're gonna do Sutton, and then we're gonna move on and do Thaddeus Russell's bad anarcho-capitalist states. It's a mouthful. Anyway, let me change my background here because that's kind of busy. Sorry. I'll do that in a moment. So again, we're going to go first into Antony Sutton and his influence in the populist and libertarian movements. So what makes his work so popular, and why does it, and do you think in any way it kind of reflects the kind of the political identity crisis and various things we see going on now in the States in particular?
Yeah, very much so. What makes his work relevant, and even relevant to me personally on some level, and not easily dismissed the way you would something that's openly fascist or anti-Semitic, is that he is admired and to some degree promoted by very good libertarian journalists.
Okay.
He's sort of cited and referenced by Patrick Henningsen at 21st Century Wire.
Okay.
Who's a good anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist, anti-globalist technocracy, anti-medical tyranny, vaccine madness journalist. And a similar type of journalist is Patrick Wood, who is sometimes a contributor to Robert F. Kennedy's Children's Health Defense. And Patrick Wood has his own broad website called Technocracy News. And Patrick Wood is actually a former collaborator of Antony Sutton. They wrote a book together about the Trilateral Commission. And there's a guy named David A. Hughes, who's also writes a lot about malfeasance in the medical establishment and the shadiness of pandemic science. And it's
allegedly, we all know that there's nothing wrong with the vaccine, right?
No, just serious.
Wink. Anyway.
Just serious adverse events at a rate greater than 1 in 1,000.
Yeah, well, correlation is not causation. Go ahead.
Right, only with COVID is correlation.
For the censors, anyway.
I hope that day would pass, but okay. But anyway, so there's good journalists who sort of look up to the what we call the Suttonite model of global affairs, global power, and the Suttonite vision. Well, maybe I'll go a bit into his history,
okay.
And I guess, and there is a slight difference between the phases of his career. I would say the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s are all a little bit different, but they're kind of edging towards a theme. In the 1960s, he was a fairly respectable academic. He was at the University of California at one point, and although most of the time he was at the Hoover Institution. And of course, the Hoover Institution is arguably not fully academic because they have an explicitly political mission. They have a conservative mission and, for the most part, a neoconservative vision. But when he was at the Hoover Institution, he wrote 3 books about Western technology and its role in the development of the Soviet economy. And those were, fairly respected books. They were reviewed in academic publications. They were published by the Hoover Institution. And they were very fact-based, the data within them was reliable. And they were popular as kind of reference texts about the economic dealings between Western nations and the Soviet Union over the years from 1917 up to the 1960s. Now, there was a certain slant in these books, and he made some peculiar claims that some reviewers criticized him for. Like, for instance, he said that Tsarist. Well, his thesis was that Soviets don't invent anything; they have a purely parasitic relationship with Western technology. And he says, and he sort of editorializes alongside his data that communists aren't capable of technological innovation. I don't see exactly how he accounts for Sputnik. I think, but he says that there's such a gradual
industrial espionage or whatever it is.
Oh yeah. I mean, and also acquiring of Nazi technology, as the Americans did. But to the point where, but one of the more absurd things that I looked into is that he sort of claimed that Tsarist Russia was more innovative than the Soviet Union. And
did he mean like in terms of literature or something, or cultural production? Maybe.
Well, in some ways, yes. Like the section where he does this, he praises this particular aeronautic designer who worked under the Tsar, and that he had these various innovative designs for planes that hadn't been seen before in the early 20th century. And he goes on and on for like hundreds of words for several paragraphs. And then at the very end of it, in one sentence, he says, of course, production of these designs was limited by the numbers of engines they were able to produce, which was, minimal. To the point where during World War I, the Germans had 5 times as many planes as the Russians did, in spite of the fact that the Russians had also been preparing for the war. And is a factor in the Russians losing the war rather disastrously. And so there's a lot of stuff like that in the in his Western technology trilogy. In the early 70s, he left the Hoover Institution and he struck off on an independent career, catering to a right populist audience.
Okay.
Sort of the network that's associated with the John Birch Society.
Although when I am familiar with.
Although he got a big splash from a Democratic congressman who was a chairman of the Finance Committee in 1974, a guy named Wright Patman. And Wright Patman, some people will acclaim him as a populist because he wanted to do a lot of banking reform and he was opposed to banker monopolies. But Wright Patman was also a big patron of the military-industrial complex. Some of the biggest munitions plants in the country were located in his district in East Texas. And Antony Sutton first kind of became an activist when he denounced détente between the U.S. and the Soviets in the early 1970s. And the détente between the U.S. and the Soviets came out of arms control agreements, and it came out of trying to end the Vietnam War. But nonetheless, Antony Sutton denounced détente, and he had a kind of peculiar interpretation of the Vietnam War, where he said that the U.S. lost because, primarily because the Vietnamese had Soviet weapons, and that the U.S. was committing national suicide because it had done some low-key trade with the Soviets, kind of stop and start over the years. and détente promised to have more trade with the Soviets as the part of the general thawing of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
And this was going to lead to more dead Americans. Now, of course, the Vietnam War was already winding down, so how this would lead to more dead Americans, I don't quite understand.
Mm-hmm.
I don't quite understand why he perceived the Soviets as being permanent enemies of the U.S., considering that there was so much diplomacy taking place.
Mm-hmm.
But he was ideologically anti-communist, even though he portrayed himself as a critic of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
He said the Cold War was a fraud. And as I said,
now, well, what can you say something about that? What was fraudulent about the Cold War?
Well, he eventually produced a thesis, an exegesis on that, a historical one, when he wrote about the Bolshevik Revolution. And he claimed that the Bolshevik Revolution was a contrivance. It was the result of a plot by Wall Street bankers and other Western bankers, City of London, and so on, and really the whole national security establishment of the British and the Americans, to undermine capitalism in Russia, so that monopoly capitalists could easily monopolize Russia through the state economy there. That was the thesis.
Can you say that again for me? So the last part.
Well, as again, in Sutton's world, all cooperation between pretty much all interventions of the state in the market are interchangeable. Right. That's the way he sees it, and that's the way many libertarians see it.
Okay.
So he said, so that right there, that provides him with his motive, right? His motive for why Wall Street, rather than having a more diverse and unpredictable business environment.
Okay. Yeah.
They would prefer to have a simplified one. And so therefore they would support this state capitalism. He would define it that came in under the Bolsheviks.
Okay, so any kind of state-controlled capitalism or state-controlled economy, whatever you want to call it, would be something that the Wall Street, even though officially they would be against it because they have to be about open markets and all this stuff, but unofficially they're all for it because then there's fewer people to negotiate with and they can, have their monopolies and their cartels and whatnot. Is that basically what he's...
Yeah, that's his explanation of the motive.
Okay, because I also noticed he has Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution and Wall Street and the rise of Hitler.
Right.
So
those would be based on the same motive.
Same thing. Okay.
Yeah.
And well, at least it was consistent.
Yeah, okay. And so the means to do this was to undermine the more or less capitalist liberal government that was in Russia in the first half of 1917, the one that did the February Revolution, and then have it replaced by the Bolsheviks in the October Revolution. That's the thesis. And he opens the book in a very erudite academic style, and there's lots of footnotes, and it looks very impressive. But as the book goes on,
can I just stop you for a second because we have a comment from Charles. I want to say Bonner. I'm
having tough enough time keeping my train of thought without dealing with the chat.
Okay, well, it's because
I believe all these questions will be answered in time.
Okay, because I just want to. Okay, sorry.
But yes, thank you for boiling it down to to 5 words, restating Mr. Sutton's thesis. Mr. Sutton produced a little bit more evidence, although not much more than what Mr. Bonner has produced. Authentic evidence, as opposed to misrepresentations.
Okay.
So, yeah, as the book goes on, the sourcing gets more and more spotty. And my favorite one was where he cites a Moscow newspaper, and that's how he references a Moscow newspaper. No title of the newspaper. But it looks thorough because he puts the date. He's like, a Moscow newspaper in December 14th, 1917. Yada, yada, yada. But there's no footnote naming the Moscow newspaper. And then it quotes this Moscow newspaper saying that we have testimony and documents saying that the Wall Street capitalists who are in the country now are supporting the socialist revolutionaries. And it goes on with a handful of details, although not the full text, and you can't read the full text because it's not cited. And this is one of his pieces of evidence, one of the more incriminating pieces of evidence. But when I was able to find, cross-referencing it with other histories of the Russian Revolution, that this actually refers to an issue of Pravda, which is the Bolshevik newspaper, which was edited by Lenin's sister. And the socialist revolutionaries don't refer to the Bolsheviks. The socialist revolutionaries was the formal name of the government that the party that the Bolsheviks overthrew. So the opposite of the Bolsheviks, essentially. And the party that Wall Street, was supporting, but they were supporting them against the Bolsheviks. Why is this? Because the Bolsheviks wanted to end World War I, whereas the party that was known as the Socialist Revolutionaries wanted to continue the war. Throughout the book, Sutton capitalizes on all of these confusing factors in the Russian left, and in particularly around World War I. The deal with the Socialist Revolutionaries is that they were only socialist in relation to the sort of laissez-faire capitalism that was prevalent in the 1890s, which is when they were formed. They were actually far less anti-capitalist than the Bolsheviks were. And they were only revolutionary against the Tsar. In function, they were basically social democrats. And they were, rather lightweight social democrats. And like most social democrats in that era, they went along with World War I. And that is why they attracted the support of Wall Street and of the Wilson administration and of the Lloyd George administration and all of the Western allies.
Okay.
And that's why I call Sutton the serpentine scholar who ate his own tail. That's my subtitle. My subtitle for the article.
Yeah.
He actively tries to capitalize on all of these obscure aspects of World War I and of the Russian Revolution and of the sectarianism of the Russian left to basically mislead people, because people, unless they're experts in the field, don't know a whole lot about the history of World War I. They don't know a whole lot about the vagaries of the Russian left. So, I mean, that's
just is a great example of how you can use facts to tell a lie. So that individually you can be like, well, yeah, this group exists and they said this and this and that, but he's putting it together and presenting it in such a way to the narrative is false.
Right. Well, he's literally cited a Bolshevik newspaper and presented it as an anti-Bolshevik newspaper to denounce the Bolsheviks for doing something that the anti-Bolsheviks were doing, which was being funded by Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
So it's rather extraordinary stuff. Anyway.
So is there any possible way that it could just be laziness, or is this has to be deliberate? You couldn't do this unless it was deliberate.
No, because I mean, that's the remarkable thing, is that like this is a guy who presents himself as unraveling other people's conspiracies, but I think that he uses conspiratorial methods himself, just in the sense of actively trying to manipulate people and actively trying to do psychological operations. Okay. And it's like, you know, one of the things that conspiracy theorists say is that, like, if this were just a mistake, if the government was just like making mistakes, or the medical establishment is making that, the mistakes wouldn't all go in the same direction. But they all seem to serve a certain purpose. They're not random. All of Sutton's mistakes, they're not mistakes. All of his misrepresentations served his predetermined anti-communist agenda to reflect communists in the worst possible light. But what I just described, you know, that can't be done accidentally. I mean, the omission of the paper that is the source, whereas where he doesn't consistently omit the names of the papers, he does this very deliberately in order to mislead. And
is this the source? Because I still hear this every once in a while. You hear these things about people want to conflate the Bolsheviks with the Nazis and with Wall Street and with this globalism. Is this a lot of where that comes from? Is Sutton-esque?
In the populist world, yes. I mean, in the intellectual world, it would come more from, you know, the totalitarian theory. Okay. Which, you know, comes from people like Hannah Arendt and such, who see anything that isn't liberal capitalism as all being the same, you know, as all being a totalitarianism. But among the grassroots, what?
They like their false equivalences.
Yeah. And so that was Sutton. That was Sutton in the 70s. Another extraordinary thing about Sutton in the 70s is that when he testified to Congress, he also testified that he was being blacklisted by the Hoover Institution, and that he was thrown out of his job. And he went on, and in a similar method to what I just described about that Western technology book, where he goes on and on about the incredible, innovative Russian designs, Tsarist designs, but then puts like one sentence at the end mentioning that they didn't really mass produce these very well because they didn't have an industrial base and they weren't good at making engines. They were apparently just good at designing, you know, the
idea guys,
the frame of the plane and so on.
Yeah.
He goes on and on about how he was made a non-person at the Hoover Institution because they wouldn't
cancel it.
Yeah, it sounds very woke. He was
I was non-person.
Social death.
Misgendered. Go ahead. So he was unpersoned.
Yeah, because they wouldn't publish things like Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, which are full of basically fraudulent material, and also the National Suicide book, which is kind of a more polemical and more poorly sourced version of the academic work he'd done in the 60s. Because they weren't enthusiastic about publishing that he was being politically targeted, and he equated it to a Soviet repression and to, quote, Hitler's book burnings. At the end of this monologue, this testimony, he passingly mentions that he still has an office at the Hoover Institution and he's still getting his monthly research grants.
What's he bitching about?
I don't know. And that's never been cleared up. There was no hostile questioning at the Congressional Committee because he was invited by the committee chairman to testify for a basic agenda against détente, which the committee chairman supported. And in spite of Sutton making this sound like a huge scandal, no one investigated this. Congress didn't investigate it. Conservative journalists didn't investigate it. Libertarian journalists didn't investigate it. But libertarian journalists who, like Sutton, have since repeated it. And so it's a very, very odd thing. And then on the back cover of Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, in addition from the early 80s, it says that he's still affiliated with the Hoover Institution. And I emailed Sutton's publisher, his current publisher. He's deceased, but his books are still on copyright. They still have a publisher. And this publisher said he was a friend of Antony Sutton, that he handled the purchase of his copyrights and so on. And I emailed him and I asked, do you know when he actually left the Hoover Institution? Because there's this, contradiction in the testimony. It doesn't really seem to make sense. And he said he didn't know that. And I emailed the Hoover Institution, because another odd thing is that Antony Sutton's papers are housed at the Hoover Institution. This place where he says he was blacklisted and they were burning his books. But
well, maybe it's classified material. Is it?
Well,
they'll open it up, in 60 years or something.
Well, the papers are not well cataloged, but I don't know what to say about that. But they are available.
Okay.
But I emailed them and I said, can you tell me, did he leave these behind when he left, or did he actively donate them to the Hoover Institution? And they said they couldn't tell me anything. So it's a very, very odd, mystique that surrounds this person.
It's a secondary storyline.
Yes, and then in the 1980s, it started getting.
If anybody out there knows why the Hoover Institute has all of his papers when he was apparently blacklisted by them, please let Garrett know.
Yeah.
I think to the 70s, yeah. So what was the switch from the 70s to the 80s then?
In the 80s, he started. Well, an interesting thing about in the early 70s, when Sutton entered the populist movement, he came in casting a critical eye towards Illuminati theories. Now, Illuminati theories are something that go back to the 18th century. It goes without saying that that's when the actual historical Illuminati existed. There is a documented, there's a documented secret society that existed in the 1700s in Prussia. And that relates to a curious thing about the populist movement, is that they're skeptical of, to some degree, of the entire Enlightenment. The conservatives are, or at least of the French Revolution, and they're skeptical of like Masonic symbolism, which is what that eye in the pyramid on the dollar bill is. But of course, the reason that the Masonic symbolism is there is because half the founding fathers were Masons. So if you think that's devilish, then you should also think that the founding fathers are devilish and that America is devilish. But they don't.
Well, I mean, that's a common.
But they don't think the founding fathers are.
You'll get no argument from the 1619 Project about that.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, that's the anarchist element of it, is that there's everything is suspect and everything is
mystery wrapped in a riddle.
Well, no, everything is corrupt.
Okay.
Including the things that, in theory, were progressive. But the Illuminati theories, we'll get to the 1619 Project when we talk about Thaddeus. I think that there's more parallels there.
Okay.
But where the hell was I?
Illuminati, 1980s.
Yeah,
everything's corrupt.
The Illuminati.
All from since the French Revolution, I guess.
The Illuminati theories got popular among sympathizers with the aristocracy during the French Revolution, and they wanted to present the idea that the French Revolution was, had no it had no purchase among the British populace. I mean, the French populace. It wasn't an organic revolutionary movement. It was the product.
It was a color revolution,
basically.
Okay.
No one ever calls 1776 a color revolution. They always stop short of that. But as I said, that's the exception to all revolutions. But I also wouldn't want to dismiss the idea that color revolutions exist. But the evidence, obviously, for the popularity of the French Revolution and the unpopularity of the aristocracy is rather overwhelming if you go by the actual documentation. Nonetheless, the Illuminati theories were actually quite popular in the U.S. in the rivalry between Thomas Jefferson and the Federalists.
Okay.
The big election of 1800, which was between John Adams and the Federalists and Thomas Jefferson, and what were known then as the Democratic Republicans. And Jefferson and most of the people in his circle and the newspapers that were associated with them were quite enthusiastic about the French Revolution. And so the Federalists were very hostile to it. And so they actually accused Thomas Jefferson of being an Illuminati agent and all of his followers. That's how that legend and that fear first came to America. But that's not talked about now. And it's kind of related to fears of democracy, and to paint democracy as being illegitimate, or to paint democracy as being explicitly anti-Christian. Sutton sort of came into the sort of John Birch affiliated world. And he said that he presented himself as a real academic, and I've looked at this and I've cross-referenced it, yada, yada, yada. And he was critiquing the work of a woman named Nesta Webster, who was the 20th century popularizer of Illuminati theories. And she adopted it to the Russian Revolution. And she said this was a product of Illuminati type conspiracies, and it was the same secret society that had perpetrated the French Revolution, perpetrated the Russian Revolution. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was imported by Tsarist agents around the same time as Nesta Webster was writing this, and she adopted that as well. Of course, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion say that there's one, vast Jewish cabal that runs the world, and it runs both the left and right. It sets itself under many masks. That was something that Nesta Webster, this anti-communist conspiracy theorist, gradually adopted as well, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and she eventually became a Hitler supporter. And she eventually became a favorite of the John Birch Society in the 50s and 60s. One of the co-founders of the John Birch Society was a guy named Revelo P. Oliver. And prior to Antony Sutton, he was the foremost academic involved in the John Birch Society anti-communist circles. He was a classics professor at the University of Illinois. In the late 60s, there was a scandal where Revelo P. Oliver came out openly as an anti-Semite and more or less as a Nazi, because he said he was also anti-Christian. He was a neo-pagan. He was a eugenicist. And it nearly led to the collapse of the John Birch Society.
Okay.
Because, as I said, he wasn't just anti-Semitic, he was anti-Christian, he was neo-pagan.
He was very diverse.
And you know,
intersectional.
Anti-Christianity doesn't go over too well in the
yeah. Garrett, keep on going. I just need to drop out for like 5 seconds and close the window, and then I'll be back. But keep on going.
So, Sutton came in at a very opportune time for the anti-communist movement, because they had lost, one of their foremost academic thinker, their foremost intellectual, Revelo P. Oliver. And he came in to kind of replace him and kind of reform their conspiracy theory. He rejected the anti-Semitic stuff, and he took a kind of dim view of the Illuminati stuff as not being well documented and well reasoned. And so Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, in many respects, is actually, Sutton acknowledges this, is in some ways quite similar to the anti-Semitic theories that had sprung up around the Russian Revolution. But he maintained that the fact that this was the grain of truth in them, but that this grain of truth was not anti-Semitic. There's a huge secret global order. There's a Wall Street Moscow nexus, but and it's almost identical to the protocols of the Elders of Zion, but without
the Jewish people,
right?
Yeah, or with not
yeah.
Yeah.
Although I mean it has this in spite of refuting that, it does adopt a lot of the same misrepresentations that had come out of this sort of anti-Semitic legend. Like, for instance, claiming that Trotsky was aided by British intelligence, and that's how he ended up in Russia after being initially detained in Canada by the British. I mean, this is another one of his kind of outright fabrications. I looked it up, and it turns out that actually the Russian minister at the time, the liberal Russian minister, had told the British to free Trotsky because Trotsky was not a Bolshevik at that time. He was a rival of Lenin's. And the liberal Russian administration thought that they could use him against Lenin. So that actually is not anti-Bolshevik, but Sutton presents it as such. And another big lie that he presents is claiming that Woodrow Wilson personally gave Trotsky a passport to get back to Russia. And what that actually turns out to be is that in 1911, before he was president, Wilson agreed to lobby for, I think it's the Jewish National Congress or something, who wanted greater passage of sort of exiled Russian refugee Jews, Russian Jews, to be able to go back to Russia. And the Tsar was putting up various obstacles. So Wilson, before he was president, lobbied for liberalizing migration of all Russian Jews, not just Trotsky. And Trotsky, in fact, had not been to America at that point. So that's how much That's how much that data is tortured. And that legend, as I said, it originated in the sort of all these anti-Semitic myths that were propagated at the time of the Russian Revolution.
So just to make sure I have it clear, so according to Sutton's findings, this Moscow Wall Street nexus, I guess, and also later, that Trotsky was intricate. He was the point man for this at the beginning. Is that kind of how he wants to position Trotsky?
Yeah.
Double agent, maybe triple agent. Yeah.
Right. And the fact that he's Jewish is just a coincidence. I mean,
he has to cover all his bases. Yeah.
There is documentary evidence that Trotsky was aided by wealthy Jews on Wall Street because he was an anti-czarist. But the wealthy Jews were assisting everyone who is anti-czarist, not just the Bolsheviks, not just Trotsky, but also those who are more pro-capitalist and not Marxist. So that doesn't actually tell you anything about the Bolsheviks. That doesn't tell you anything about Wall Street, because the majority of bankers on Wall Street, contrary to what you've heard, are not Jewish.
No.
So in the 80s, Sutton, he really outdid himself, because he came around to then supporting the Illuminati theories, because he said he had found new information. Now, this new information couldn't be verified because he said he got it from a confidential source. But by this time, Sutton was so far removed from any academic standards, and he was so popular among the populist, anti-communist media network that this was accepted among those circles. And he also did frame it with something that there was a grain of truth in, which was the Skull and Bone Society at Yale. And there really is a Skull and Bone Society at Yale.
Yeah.
They really are linked to the American elite. But he claimed to have documentary evidence that said that Skull and Bones were the Illuminati. They were just a rebranding of the Illuminati, transferred from Prussia to Yale. And he claimed, but there was no documentary evidence other than this documentary evidence, which he claimed to have from a confidential source, which has never been verified.
It's probably him.
Well, it could be Richard Pearl, actually, but we'll get into that. Because he said that was one of his pals later on. In the same book where he presented this, which is a book called America's Secret Establishment, he presented his theories about what he called Hegelian dialectic. And he's presented the Hegelian dialectic somehow citing no writing of Hegel. He just cited the sort of what many people would say is the vulgarization of Hegel, of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and that the Illuminati are basically controlling the world by running the thesis, the antithesis, to produce the synthesis that they want. And so, Wall Street and the Bolsheviks would be one version of that.
Okay.
And so,
so I guess I'd be like, they're a fundamentalist Hegelian, and like a lot of fundamental, but based on the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that quite rightly, Hegel never wrote it that way. One of his contemporaries, I think, I can't remember the name anyway, but yeah. So the idea that they take us very seriously. So even if you have to contrive, so they have to know what the thesis and antithesis is of the synthesis they want, and then which is what, one world government.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have the uber capitalists on one side, and then you have the communists on the other, and through this clash, they get what they want.
Right.
Okay.
And so there's this whole
At least it's tidy.
yeah.
Unlike
So
Hegel.
there's this whole parallel understanding of alternative meaning of Hegelian dialectic, which is nothing like the version that philosophers have. And of course, this is helpful to anti-communism because Marx is associated with Hegel. And this is sort of like the historical version of what James Lindsay does now. Lindsay has never acknowledged Sutton, but it feels like there's probably some influence there in terms of this sort of actively misrepresenting, the source material towards this very predetermined anti-communist end.
Yeah.
And also in the 1980s, Sutton gave, he had a newsletter and he started giving talks at an assortment of fringe groups. But one of the most interesting ones was the sort of New Age group that was run by this woman named Elizabeth Clare Prophet. And Elizabeth Clare Prophet was into all of these esoteric scriptures, the Book of Enoch, like apocryphal Judaic scriptures and
mysticism and all that,
lost gospels and all of this stuff. And she said that she was clairvoyant, and so she knew things that about global affairs that were not known to most people, and she had found this psychically. But she had an interview with Sutton where they said they were on the same page, and he had found
they're tuned in the same frequency, yeah.
Documentation for their prophecies. Now, some of the predictions that he started making were not they didn't bear quite the fruit that he hoped. He said that the Soviets were growing stronger in the mid 80s. He was complaining that they were claiming that they were going to withdraw from Afghanistan, but that was a lie, and that Reagan was being too soft on communism by entering into diplomacy, facilitating withdrawal. And then he also said that the Soviets were going to bully the U.S. Through nuclear brinksmanship into surrendering. He actually said this in the interview with Elizabeth Clare Prophet. Of course, a few years later, the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union was no more. And Elizabeth Clare Prophet, she was so worried about nuclear war and the Soviets launching a nuclear first strike that she built a compound. She built an underground compound in the Midwest. And she got like over 100 of her followers to join her there. And some of them like sold their houses and, broke off from the families and all of this. And she had a particular date in like 1988 or something where the Soviets were going to attack us. And that passed without any event. And she told her followers it was just a drill
to test the faithful, or
to test the faithful, I guess.
Like Abraham and his son. Anyway.
So yeah, that's Antony Sutton.
And was that the last thing? Was that kind of like that was where he peaked? Was at
pretty much.
Okay.
He was getting old. His he lived until 2002, so for another 12 years. But I would say that I think his reputation may have taken a hit, obviously, after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah. It's kind of like hard to revise that. Like, what? Oh, no, don't be fooled. Okay, so so I guess, I mean, one of the things that's quite clear is that he's very skeptical of any kind of centralized or a power or any kind of collective. So whether it be, state socialism or fascism or capitalism, everything, all of those are controlled by elites. So it's just a kind of a different, it's old wine, different bottles, but same wine. So is this why? This must be why he still quite resonates with anarcho-capitalists, including James Lindsay, even though James Lindsay may not be aware of it or may not want to highlight that similarity.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, his vision of the just society and the free society doesn't seem to have a government, really. He doesn't see any legitimate regulatory role. So he casts all of the regulations as being conspiracies, essentially, by those who are being regulated. And this does cross over into mainstream libertarianism. And this actually is one of the few crossovers, I would say, between Sutton and Thaddeus Russell, is that both of them recommended a guy named Gabriel Kolko. Gabriel Kolko was an economic historian who was very popular with libertarians, although he himself comes from the left, the non-communist left. But he comes from a sort of populist. Honestly, it's kind of hard to suss out. Exactly.
You can't cover everything. You're not Sutton. You're not going to tie it all up with a nice, even convoluted bow. Yeah.
It might be described more as anarcho-communism.
Okay.
He would say that the Bolsheviks didn't have a real revolution at all. And he would say that all of the reforms to regulate capitalism in the progressive era actually facilitated monopoly capitalism. That's a major thesis of a lot of his work.
So does he think then, because of course with Marxists it would be like it left the kind of natural, if what does they call it, rules of motion or laws of motion, that you're going to end up with monopolies if you don't have some sort of political intervention or some sort of I guess counter movement, if you want to put on a Polanyian hat. But they don't think that's the case. They think that's all a lie, that all this monopoly stuff is somehow an intervening hand that shouldn't be intervening.
Yeah, they do. The interesting thing about Kolko's work is that it's actually been empirically it was kind of debunked by some other libertarians who said that he had misrepresented the patterns of monopoly and the sources of monopoly in the late 19th century. And they pointed out that there's a lot of voluntary combination by capitalists, as well as obviously, the whole boom bust cycle that takes out, smaller businesses and gets them, bought out and acquired by bigger businesses. Also, there's cases of big firms voluntarily combining in order to in order to defray the costs of competition. And there's a huge documentation of that, of voluntary consolidation. And there's lots, there's lots of economic economic historians who document that.
Yeah.
that pattern in the mid to late 19th century, prior to the major antitrust regulation. It was in states that had the sort of least regulation that monopolies tended to incorporate themselves, like Delaware, for instance. That pattern was already emerging in the late 19th century, prior to the progressive movement.
Okay, because I was thinking about it seems that even though it's clear that the boogeyman, the culprit, and all this stuff is the centralized power, whatever say that is, it could be a socialist state, a fascist state, a capitalist state, or whatever. It's the state that is problematic here. But he also seems to be, by that same argument, is saying also something that's most Marxists would agree with, that the capitalist market requires a strong state. So how can you, if they have, so the idea that you can keep the capitalism but get rid of the state seems, even by his own kind of interesting research and argument that you could get from his own work, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I don't know what I don't know what the positive model is of this. In the libertarian literature that I've read, as I said, when I've met Thaddeus Russell, and I was at a conference that he hosted a few years ago, and I actually asked him, because he was a libertarian, and so many of the journalists that I liked were libertarian, writing about current affairs and the positions that they took against the COVID mandates, and against a lot of transgender. Well, not necessarily at the forefront of transgender, but at least they were.
Oh, he's a genderist as well. He had that interesting thing, I think in 2014 in Joe Rogan. Yeah, Thaddeus Russell is not. He's broadly behind the whole gender schmender.
Right.
But he just thinks they've taken it too far. But he doesn't apparently he thinks that male women.
So maybe not transgender, but as far as COVID stuff, and as far as cancel culture and so on and so forth, and as far as war and imperialism, I like a lot of libertarian journalists, and I wish I could go all the way with them sometimes. But
Scott Horton,
it just doesn't make any sense to me.
Scott Horton.
Yeah, he's libertarian.
Yeah, he's a good one, isn't he?
He's a good journalist, but I think he also likes it. But I think he also likes Antony Sutton.
Yeah.
There have been a handful of libertarians who have criticized Antony Sutton. There's this guy, Richard Cox, who's a podcaster. He did a really funny podcast about Sutton's 80s wingnut shit. And Michael Rechtenwald, who heads the Mises caucus in the Libertarian Party, he also he's a historian, and he kind of fact-checked some things in Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. So some libertarians are too smart for it, but a lot of them aren't. But what was I going to say? So I asked Thaddeus Russell, as a left-wing person who's curious about libertarianism and sort of dealing with Marxist objections to capitalism, like who should I read? He said Gabriel Kolko. But Gabriel Kolko doesn't really seem to have a feasible, positive vision. He just has this critique of anti-monopoly legislation, anti-corporatist legislation. And as I said, this critique of government regulation of business doesn't really seem to be empirically based. So, I mean, that's why I'm not a libertarian.
They think they know what they don't want, but they're not sure what they do want. They just think if they get rid of what they don't like, that somehow that in of itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
creates a anarcho-capitalist wonderland or something.
Well, they're leaving out a huge, chunk of capitalist history. And when you're talking about state intervention, like some of them are opposed to central banks, but it's like there was no like really liberal capitalism before the Bank of England. It's like the rise of British capitalism started at the same time that the Bank of England was founded, and the Bank of England was co-founded by John Locke. He was kind of part of the whole revolution of 1688, and Adam Smith endorsed the Bank of England, and Alexander Hamilton wanted a central bank for the U.S. So it's like, how do you really separate capitalism from central banks and some degree of central government regulation? I don't think that you can. But they just sort of omit this aspect.
Yeah. No, I think that's just to kind of restate what you just said. There is this focus on, and with Sutton as well, from what I gathered from your article, a focus on a conspiracy focus on bad actors rather than systemic forces, or just like the laws of motion of capitalism that the Marxist political economists and others have shown. So it will tend towards concentration and centralization, monopoly, unless there's some, and then also that the states and markets, at least the state as we understand today, have arose dialectically together, you could say, and probably not on accident. There's more than there's a causation between the state and market relationship, but it's not just correlation. But they don't seem to want to deal with that at all.
No, they don't.
Or they just have this kind of Adam Smith romantic idea of capitalism, or
basically, yeah. Which is sort of based more on a natural, idealistic, natural law theory that isn't, really based on the history of humanity, right? Because it's generally agreed that humanity was communistic in its non-state formations. They don't have a concept of private property. And so that concept develops with civilization, but that means it also develops with the state.
Yeah, hard to have private property without some sort of authority that can allocate or acknowledge the rights between people, and also adjudicate them. Yeah, but I just think that in terms of in a small scale, you can have an anarcho-capitalist little community. If everyone had so many acres in their house, they're kind of all frontiersmen or something, or petit bourgeois. But when you put in the other stuff, then it becomes increasingly problematic. How this would all hang together.
A lot of this probably is related to the frontier, and the discovery of America, and the settlement of America, and just like that there was this weird sort of a limbo between civilization and non-civilization, where where there was a weak state, and it seemed like I don't know, that market relations weren't regulated. But of course, these people ended up in America because there was a strong feudal state, projecting its forces outward. And they were, still using U.S. currency for the most part. So it still doesn't make very much sense. But there is this sort of like utopia that comes from the frontier vision, and thinking that can just go on, and that just emerged out of nowhere, and that's rather than being projected outward from Europe.
Okay, so before we take a little bit of a break and move on to unregistered Thaddeus Russell, it seems that his work, while influential, reflects like what you mentioned several times, a problem within libertarian anarcho-capitalist thought, again, the focus on conspiracies and elites and that obscure any kind of that just conveniently leave the rest of political economy out. So is this
I
legacy?
should be clear. I should be clear, by the way, that people don't know me. I am a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah.
It's just it's just like
it has to hold together.
It has to hold together. And there are some things that governments have done and events in history that can't be explained by the documentary evidence that we have. It can't be explained by any of the official narratives that we have.
Well, and conspiracy,
and in those voids of knowledge, it's appropriate to present an alternative theory. But not everything is a void of knowledge. And Antony Sutton has actually tried to create voids where voids don't exist. Like, it wasn't mysterious how Trotsky got released from Canada, and got into Russia. It isn't mysterious how he got a passport out of the U.S. And it's also not mysterious how the Bolsheviks got the support of the Russian people. If you look into it, like, there's even other anti-communist historians who just announced, well, the other parties, the Tsar and the liberals, they just didn't have any better solutions. They wanted to continue World War I. People wanted out of that. They wanted land reform. The other parties weren't willing to go far enough with that. So that's how so there isn't really any mystery when you look into it that needs to be explained, that you need to resort to a conspiracy theory in that case.
Well, yeah, and also the materialist account that you just gave is something they don't want to have game purchase in the United States and other countries either.
Yeah,
I mean, it's kind of a win-win for them. But I guess it's kind of this weaponizing of ignorance in the service of a kind of an anti-collectivist or anti-statist agenda, regardless of if it's socialist or capitalist or whatever. And that, of course, like, I think it's quite, we'll have to think about this some more, about how how Lindsay is the contemporary of Antony Sutton. That's the legacy there. I think that we'll have to underline that and revisit it.
Well, yeah, there's a lot to be said about that whole Hegelian paranoia thing, that paranoia about Hegel, which is really, that is tied into libertarianism. And there's a whole like, I don't know, there's a paranoia about the dialectic, and a lot of it is based on sort of like blaming Marx and Hegel for inventing things that they didn't invent. It's like, Marx didn't invent conflict theory, and he didn't invent the concept of the oppressed. But you hear right-wingers say things like that.
Oh yeah.
The concept of the oppressed versus the oppressor goes back to the Book of Exodus.
Yeah.
Which is why Nietzsche denounced the Jews, or denounced Jewish culture alongside socialism, because he says it gave birth to socialism. But that's a connection that right-wingers aren't going to make. No.
All right. So before we take a bit of a break and move on to Thaddeus and his interesting takes on the relationship between his equivalence of that there's no meaningful difference between Stalin, Lenin, and Trotsky, and his idea that communism is equal to forced collectivization, and some other interesting things. I want to ask you before we switch over to that and take a bit of a break. What's the one takeaway? Because a lot of people probably aren't very familiar with Antony Sutton, or maybe they come across this and they haven't heard of him before. So what would be like the one main takeaway you'd want people to have about Sutton and his contemporary influence or legacy?
I would say keep watching those libertarian journalists, if you have to, because some of them are very good. They're saying things that liberal journalists aren't saying, including, left liberal journalists, which, are basically satellites of the Democratic Party.
No, we're not saying to unperson any of these people.
Right. I'm definitely not pushing cancel culture here, but I am sort of pushing caveat emptor, which is let the buyer beware. Just like because a lot of these libertarian journalists give a fairly accurate portrayal of the present, doesn't mean that they have an accurate portrayal of the past and in their overall theoretical framework. I think that's the important part. Also, this is the book you should read instead of or alongside Antony Sutton. It's called America's Secret War Against Bolshevism by Daniel S. Fogelsong.
Okay.
This is a much better source book than Antony Sutton. And it talks about how the predisposition and overall trend of the U.S. Government was to support the White Russians, from the moment the Bolshevik Revolution happened, and even the Tsarists. They had been backing the liberals, but when the liberals fell from power, they said, "Well, we'd rather have the Tsarists back than have the Bolsheviks," and they literally gave them hundreds of millions of dollars. Which is, billions in today's money. And Sutton makes a big deal about the fact that he can document 1 million that went to the Bolsheviks from a Western source, a Wall Street Associates source, and that was done during a period when they thought they could use Bolshevik propaganda to undermine the German war effort, right? But before that, they were giving hundreds of millions to the anti-Bolsheviks, as well as afterwards. And the U.S. actually sent troops along with the British and a dozen other capitalist countries to invade the Soviet Union, which is something that Sutton passes over, as well as most mainstream historians. But anyway.
All right. So I will. So that is a morbid symptom and social populist recommendation. Can you pull up the book just one more time before you? So America's Secret War Against Bolshevism by David S. Fogelsong?
Yes.
Oh, I said it right.
You can get it on archive.org.
On archive.org. Okay, there you go. Okay, so again, thank you. That was fantastic. And even that was correct. Garrett's overview of who is Antony Sutton and why it matters and how it's and why he's still beloved, it seems, by many libertarians. You can read the rest of that. You can read. I would want everyone to go to Covert Action magazine and check out Garrett's full article. And I will. It's linked to. I have it in the post on X of our stream, but I'll also put it later in the video description on Rumble and YouTube. So and I also want, before we take a break, I want to say that I also, when I say conspiracy theorists, I don't want to be like, because obviously a lot of these things end up being eventually being true. And conspiracies is kind of like a negative word for a plan. Like people have plans and there's other people are involved in them. And of course the formalities of whether it be any, whatever sector it is, there's also the informal and the networks and all kinds of things and shared interests and of the power elite and all of that. So I don't want to poo-poo all of that. I also, you have to, and again, we think in narratives and we form narratives. And so you can have you can have the factual record and the things that are, do leave a trace, but we have to put it together. Yeah. And it seems that Sutton was quite flexible and had an agenda for how he filtered and put together the facts and what he left out. And
I have conspiracy theories about Antony Sutton. Right? If you and any person, if any person were to apply Suttonite method to Sutton himself, they would have to conclude that he was a conspiracy theorist because he told so
Mm-hmm.
many lies. He told so many stories that didn't add up. And he
Mm-hmm.
also mentioned being friendly with people like Richard Pearl. Richard Pearl is one of the leading neoconservatives in the world. He also got a shout out from Daniel Pipes, another leading conservative, who's actually a member of the Bilderberg Group and the Council for Foreign Relations, and all of these secretive elitist globalist groups that populists are supposed to hate and denounce as fronts for communism. And Richard Pearl helped lie us into the Iraq War. That's how much of a neocon he is. So the fact that Sutton misrepresented his relationship with the Hoover Institution, it's very, very, very suspicious.
Oh, okay. All right. So should we take about a 10-minute break, Garrett?
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll take a 10-minute break and then we'll come back and we'll change gears and focus on Thaddeus Russell's or Bad Tads. That's not the name I gave him. It's apparently the name his students gave him. Hey, but we'll get into that. I'll give a bit of a biography of Bad Tad, and we'll take on his what we would characterize as a bad libertarian or bad anarcho-capitalist takes. Although he does have other good takes, he's not all of his takes are bad, and we'll get to that as well. Okay, so I'm just going to put on some music, and we'll be back in about 10 minutes with Bad Tad's bad takes. Stay tuned, everybody. All right. Garrett, are we ready to go with part 2? You're on mute.
Yeah.
Oh, right. So let me take off this banner. Let's see. Click this off. Oh, right. Welcome back. So the first part we were going, Garrett was going over Antony Sutton, who he is and why he's important to know about and how he's relevant to a lot of contemporary right populism, particularly of the libertarian variety. And now we're going to switch over to Thaddeus Russell, bad tads, bad takes. Let me get this off of here. Okay, so let's see, where is he? Here he is. So Thaddeus Russell, yes, he is a libertarian. I think he doesn't shirk at the title of anarcho-capitalist, although he's an anti-imperialist anarcho-capitalist. So he can be pro-capitalism and anti-imperialism is an interesting wrinkle, but I don't know if it figures into to what we're getting in. That's a topic for a different time. But anyway, and I want to say that I would recommend people watch his unregistered or the unrecorded or whatever it is. I think it's on once a week or a couple times a month. Unregistered, yeah. It's well worth watching, but like Garrett said before, a bit of a buyer beware, particularly anytime he's talking about Marxism or socialism or communism, I would take it with a grain of salt, maybe several grains of salt. But we don't have to swallow people, we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater or swallow thinkers whole. So I want to say that initially. Anyway, what can we say about him? He is a cultural historian, I think. He wrote a book called The Renegade History of the United States, focusing on degenerates and pirates and prostitutes and gun runners. I don't know, variety of other things that aren't politically correct topics for history teachers, I suppose. But anyway, he didn't get tenure. I don't know when that was, 2010 maybe, or 12 or whatever it was. And he associated that with that the gatekeepers of the field didn't like the topics that he was focusing on. So he decided to go off and he founded this unregistered academy, which is online, and also does podcasts. And I think he's fairly well known for interviews as well. He's quite a good interviewer. However, what we're talking about today is was this back in January? No, back this summer. And I was watching one of their shows, and he basically was saying that when he talks to his comrades in Brooklyn, so his comrades that he's talking to are people like Ben Burgess, I think like the Jacobin crew and whatnot, and that he always poses this to him that, okay, so let's say that you guys win. There's a the communists take over, the socialists take over the United States. What are you going to do with people like me who refuse to go to the collective or to the labor collective or to be collectivized? What are you going to do? How are you going to do that? And my take on that provocation is he's trying to get them to acknowledge the fact that violence would be involved, that coercion and violence would be involved to do this, to enact this forced collectivization in the United States in 2024 or 2025, as it may be. And so I flagged this, and I said, this was a tweet back in the summer. Communism equals forced collectivization. Now that's what I call a hasty generalization. This is reductive in the extreme and commits a false cause of fallacy, conveniently ignoring the uneven history and geography of material conditions, political forces, we would say the forces and relations of production that shape them both. Would love to have you on the show to explore this thought experiment. If a communist regime came to power in the States, would Thaddeus really be violently coerced into working in a factory or farm collective? Your Zoom or mine, and he never got back to me, which is fine. People aren't obligated to respond to everybody that comments on their X post, although some people seem to think that. But I would have liked to carry this out. So we'll have to do that in his stead. Why, if this one things we're going to do, is this make sense? So if we have, so this is speculative, of course, because, you know, there's no communist party, it has not won the election, and let alone can we consider the United States to have a communist or even socialist or, you know, the dictatorship of the proletariat has not come to fruition in the States, but we can see, we're going to explore this thought experiment and this, the logic or lack thereof that brings him to this point that he's quite confident that if this were to happen, that people like everyone would be forced to a factory or farm collective. And he wants to know what Ben Burgess and the other Jacobins are going to do to those who refuse to go along with it. And the second one was from earlier this month. And he had an episode, What is Neoconservatism? And he made was one to make the connection that it kind of grew out of Trotskyism because the founder of it, was it Irving Kristol, was a Trotskyist in college or whatnot. But he also makes the conflation that, you know, basically that Lenin, that there's no important difference between Stalin and Trotsky and Leninism or Lenin. So Lenin equals Stalin equals Trotsky, or Trotsky equals Stalin equals Lenin, etc. And then I said, it's interesting, or is it, that both left and right spicy liberals share the same ideological fantasy about the C word? And it just so happened that before, or I don't know if it was, I think it was after I watched his take on neoconservatism, that I happened to see a tweet from Midwestern Marx on a similar topic. And so I said, I don't know if Carlos has the same claim to expertise you do. Thaddeus Russell's parents were in a Trotsky party when he was growing up. But this seems to be more explanatory of the Trotskyite to neocon pipeline than some lazy Arendt type resemblance, in my opinion. And I linked to the article. And he did respond to this one. So he wrote back to me, the problem with this thesis is that Irving Kristol was the only neoconservative who was a Trotskyist. The rest were left liberals of various non-Marxist sorts.
That's not true.
Yeah, well, that is not true, but, you know, details. So I wrote back, and I like to have a good time on Twitter. And I asked him if his parents told him that. And you'll see why, because we're going to play a clip of, we're going to play the pertinent clips so you can hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, before we get into our take on it. So I wrote back to him. Go ahead.
He talks about that a lot, how he evaded his programming from his.
Yeah, I think the rebellion. I think the Oedipal thing is interesting. But anyway, I said the problem with this non-response is the question you posed was, what is neoconservatism? Which is about tracing its intellectual and historical lineage, not a head-counting exercise. That would be a different question, like who are the neoconservatives? Trotskyism's imprint on neoconservatism via Kristol isn't erased by the fact that more neocons end up being left liberals. Ideas do tend to transcend their originator, which is why you wanted to make so much of Kristol's political biography in the first place, isn't it? The shift to headcount of Trotskyists in the neoconservative movement sidesteps the actual historical and ideological critique I raised over the absurd gloss of Lenin equals Trotsky equals Stalin. The theoretical and political differences between these three are well documented and fundamental to understanding their respective legacies. Conflating them to draw a direct line to neoconservatism not only reduces the complexity of Marxist traditions to a caricature, but also conveniently serves your ideological agenda. And then I put our score 0-2. Because, you know, I can be, even though I'm also a type of, I guess, a social populist, I can be competitive. And to this, he didn't get back to me on it. He just let it go. So that's what we're going to do. So what I want to do first, do you have anything to say before I play the clips?
No.
No, okay. So the first one I play, I think this is the neoconservatism one. So I'll play this. It's just 2 minutes or so from his show on that is the gist of what we're going to talk about, or the take we're going to counter, or yes. So let's see. Let me click on that. I need to share my screen. So let's see. Share screen. What is neoconservatism? Share. Okay. Now, hopefully this works.
Now, Irving Kristol, I'm sure many of you have heard me discuss this before, was a member as a young man, as a college student. He was a member of the Young People's Socialist League, otherwise known as YPSL, YPSL, when he was a student at City College of New York City. This was the very same organization that my parents belonged to about 10 years after he was a member of YPSL. YPSL was an offshoot of the Socialist Party of America, which earlier in the century was the largest radical left party in the country's history. The YPSL youth offshoot, though, took a more radical bent than the Socialist Party proper, and were eventually taken over, or essentially taken over, by Trotskyists, disciples of Leon Trotsky, the Bolshevik Russian revolutionary who was exiled by Stalin in a rivalry. It was not ideological. It was Stalin's attempt to dispose of his chief rival, which he did. He was exiled to Mexico, where he was assassinated by one of Stalin's assassins with an ice pick through the brain. So Trotsky's politics, there will be some Trotskyists maybe who see this who will get upset with me, but being the son of Trotskyists and having studied Trotsky and having been a member myself very early in my life of the Trotskyist organization, I think I can say with some confidence that I know what I'm talking about, in that his politics, Trotsky's politics, essentially and in the end and effectively were not substantially different than Stalin's. No one would argue they were substantially different than Lenin's, which is to say, we are talking about an authoritarian, statist, socialist, revolutionary form of government and economics. Highly authoritarian, collectivist, and I think most of us know the rest of the story. But that's who Irving Kristol and some, not all. There's a misconception that all of the neocons were originally Trotskyists. That's not true. Kristol was the main one who was a Trotskyist. The others, as far as we can tell, were sort of left liberal types, certainly on the left, socialistic at least, but not actual Trotskyists, meaning they weren't revolutionary. They weren't advocating, like Trotsky, an armed revolution in all the bourgeois countries of the world. So that's where they started, though.
Okay. So before I get to how my role is going to be, I'm just going to point out the fallacies that he's making. So I'm going to focus on the form, I guess, of the argument, and Garrett will be our content person. But I thought it was just kind of funny because it's basically he does this appeal to authority to deflate counters. Like, look, I know what I'm talking about because my parents were part of this organization. So, it's basically an appeal to authority. So relying on personal or external credentials as proof of the argument's validity rather than engaging in evidence or reasoning. So it applies because he says his parents' involvement in Trotsky Party somehow making him authority on Marxism, socialism, all of it. However, this is irrelevant to whether his arguments are accurate. Is quite clear. And it's a problem because it bypasses the need for critical engagement with actual historical and theoretical complexities of Marxism and reduces the debate to personal experience, which cannot substitute, sorry, bad Tad, for rigorous analysis. And the counter to that would be understanding the distinctions between Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin require engaging actually with their specific ideological debates and historical actions, not relying on personal anecdotes or family dramas, etc. And so there's a broader theme that this reliance on anecdotal authority mirrors a common tendency in anarcho-capitalist thought to avoid engaging with systematic critiques of capitalism and relying rather on a kind of a convenient just so type of narrative of how the dots connect. But would be my formal critique in terms of the elements of argument. And unless people think I'm being mean, he's a professor. Yeah, he's a professor of history, and he is
So
the
is Anthony Sutton.
founder and director of the Unregistered Academy. So it's more than fair for me to hold him to a certain standard. I too am part of the guild. I have a doctorate. So there you go. So do people think I'm just, picking hairs here? So what would you want to say to Tad's, bad Tad's, and I'm not being mean about that either, because apparently that's what his students called him. He was very popular because he talked about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So why wouldn't he be? But anyway, go ahead, Garrett.
Well.
Anything you want to take from that?
Yeah, where to begin? Well, neoconservatism began as an anti-communist movement. I mean, it as I said, it goes back to the early 70s, and Thaddeus Russell wouldn't disagree with me about the chronology. He's just sort of fudging over the fundamental anti-communist aspect of it. It was opposed to détente. It was uncomfortable with the process that helped end the Vietnam War. It was uncomfortable with the fact that there was more negotiation and trading with the Soviets.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a wholly Cold War phenomenon, and he seems to be kind of fudging it into a sort of reading history backwards from like the War on Terror to pretend that it didn't come out of anti-communism. Now you could say there's a broader thing that has to do with American imperialism and American nationalism, and the presumption that there's dangerous, there's dangerous foreigners who are about to take over the world, and we have to, fight them over there so we don't fight them over here, and that sort of thing. But Trotskyists are anti-Soviet, which, if you define communism as actually existing communist governments, communism is a form of functional anti-communism. I mean, that's something. Functionally, it is anti-communism, however much it celebrates the Communist Manifesto. And he's not dealing with that. And as far as, I don't know,
the idea that Trotsky and Stalin didn't have, there was no ideological differences there. It was just a power grab. He wanted to get rid of his opponent, his competitor, so he kicked him out.
Yeah. Now, I guess Trotsky and Stalin's differences, they have to do more with permanent revolution and where the revolution is supposed to stop and what direction it's supposed to take. And so I guess you could say on that level, Trotskyism is super communism, but it's not normal communism.
They also differed on the peasants. Yeah, they also differed on the peasants issue and how to deal with the peasantry.
In the short term, yes. Trotsky actually wanted to work the peasants, or he wanted to be more aggressive on the peasants on forced collectivization initially. Because he wanted to get to full communism, within a generation. And Stalin initially opposed that because I think he was a bit more populist, and at that point the majority of the Soviet Union still was peasant, and he didn't want to be too forceful on them just in the name of an ideological agenda. Stalin changed his mind principally because he believed that fascism was on the march beginning in the 1920s, and I don't know who would argue with him. Let me get a quote here. When Stalin proposed the first 5-year plan at the 15th Congress of the Bolsheviks in 1927, he said, "In view of a possible military attack by capitalist states against the proletarian state, the 5-year plan should devote maximum attention to the fastest possible development of those sectors of the economy which play the main role in securing the country's defense and providing economic stability in war." So there was, Stalin became more aggressive towards collectivization and industrialization from that point. And he saw fascism as the spear tip of capitalism. So that's part of what he's referring to there when he's talking about the attacks by capitalist states. But forced collectivization, meaning speedy collectivization, wasn't his first choice. It was more a product of circumstances than ideology.
Mm-hmm. All right, and so, and also, because he, if I remember correctly, he wanted to kind of characterize as like Trotsky was like the head honcho of the Bolshevik revolution, second only to Lenin, which is not accurate, is it?
No, as I said before, Trotsky joined the Bolsheviks less than 6 months before the revolution, which is to say more than 10 years after the Bolsheviks were founded. Mm-hmm. Whereas Stalin was in it almost from the beginning. So Lenin and Stalin were much closer.
Okay.
And there's a claim that Lenin wrote like a deathbed letter denouncing Stalin, but that's disputed, if that letter is authentic. Okay.
So, but what? To be fair, is there anything to this equivalence of his that he's making, that it's all the same thing? Leninism, the Trotskyism, Stalinism, Leninism, it's all just a different name for the same stuff. And it's basically totalitarian and the government telling you what to do and how and when and all this. That's where all these roads lead to.
No, it's not the same thing. If you want to say authoritarianism and say force, I won't argue with that, in the sense that all civilization and all strong states use force, and they use authoritarianism, and that's actually not shouldn't be controversial among Marxists, although some of the less educated ones would dispute that. But there's actually an essay by Frederick Engels from 1872, I believe, called "On Authority," where he's having it out with the anarchists and saying, no, we are not anti-authoritarians. Our enemies are authoritarians. Politics involves force. Government involves force. And we want a change in government. Every change in government in the bourgeois revolutions and in the fights between, to take down the aristocracy or to take down the tyranny of the Catholic Church or what have you. I mean, or to end slavery, those all involved force and authoritarianism. Thaddeus would probably consider Abraham Lincoln to be an authoritarianism. Some of the things I've seen him write about the Civil War and slavery suggests that he does think Abraham Lincoln was an authoritarian. So communism is authoritarian in the same way Abraham Lincoln was in freeing slaves. Stalin said he would liquidate the kulaks as a class. Lincoln liquidated the slave owners as a class.
They probably didn't like it. I don't think they liked it.
No, there may have been some.
They thought it was oppressive to take their property away. Yeah. And I was it also is just kind of this thing as if it's always this thing that somehow under capitalism, there's everybody's just footloose and fancy free, like there's no constraints or unfreedoms or limit or constrictions put on that. I guess you could say you could free to starve. You're free. You don't have to work. You don't have to have health insurance or all this type of thing. But the idea that it's a particular type of freedom. That they also don't get too I guess beyond the don't tread on me. They don't really flesh that out too much, especially because they don't want to get beyond the individual. And as soon as you get beyond the individual, then freedom becomes a more complicated matter, I would say.
To me, it's a purely idealistic position. It doesn't tell you anything about getting from point A to point B. It's not a good look for a historian or someone who pretends to be dealing with material matters and actual human events.
Yeah, but he would to that he I think he says he's a cultural historian and he likes to look at politics.
So.
He likes to look, conveniently enough, he likes to look at politics, or he looks at politics through the lens of culture, which of course is something which is the opposite of what Marxists would do of any sort, or any sort of materialist. We look at politics through the materialist lens, the socials, the relations and forces of production and other things. So
yeah, and it's different from what a conservative realist would do too.
Okay, what would be what?
Well, they have their own quandaries, but they would acknowledge that the state serves a purpose, and feel behooved to sort of explain how, for instance, your property rights are supposed to be protected without a state. One thing I'll give Thaddeus credit for. I mean, he is being consistent in being an anarchist. I mean, he believes in what I've heard called a forceless utopia. He thinks that there could be a world where there's no force employed, and somehow politics can exist without any force employed.
I wonder what goes on where he lives. I mean, well,
yeah, I mean, it's basically the same thing as pacifism, right? Okay. I mean, but the majority of people don't buy that pacifism can work, and for the same reason, anarchism can't really work.
Okay. All right. So let's see. We got on that. Now let's get to the more fun one, perhaps. I'll play this clip where he talks about his gotcha question that no one has been able to give him an answer to, and I think he should maybe ask different people than the Jacobin crew. He might get a more interesting conversation. So let me play that. Share my screen. Let's see. Hopefully this works. Let's see. 4950. Okay. Let me see if I can find this. Talk amongst yourselves. Oh, where is this? Skip ad. Make sure the volume's working. Enable. Okay, so is this 4950? Okay, I'm going to share my screen, but I have to share a different screen. So share screen, Rumble. Share, and I'll go back to 4950, or maybe I'll just go back a little bit more just to make sure.
Once the Zionist project fails and that the United States government owes them that.
Well, wait. That's for Israelis, right? Yeah. So the people who happen to be born there, who, of course, if you're born there, you have no culpability about anything. It's if you choose then to be a Zionist, and advance the Zionist project ideologically, then yeah, I think you should probably live in the Arctic Circle.
Okay. So
I mean, honestly, it's a war-making ideology. Like it's like communism, in that it's guaranteed to create war, right? Like you must use physical violence to enact this ideology. Like it's right, like communism. You have to force people to work in the agricultural collectives and the collective factories, and you have to force people to do all kinds of stuff. And those who resist that, you got to put them in the gulags or shoot them. And we know this. But it also just makes sense because they're gonna have to shoot me. I know that. So because I won't work. I've told communists to their face on their podcasts from Brooklyn. Every time I say, hey, comrade, listen, I know you're a nice guy and you make a great latte, but when you have a communist regime in my country, I won't work. What are you going to do? And they'd be like, hamana. I'm like, no, I won't work. What are you going to do? And they're like, hamana, oh, we won't. And you know, I've had this debate with Ben Burgess, Michael Brooks before he died. Lots of communists on Twitter. You can look it up. Go look, on YouTube. And I say, because you're going to have to do something really bad to me, my friend, because these are friends of mine. I look at them, and I used to be you, by the way. I used to be a socialist, and then I realized to be a socialist, you have to do violence because there will be people who will refuse to be socialist. And you can't allow that. You can't allow people to not cooperate. Same with Zionism. It requires violence so long as the Palestinians...
Okay, hold on. So, go ahead, Garrett.
So, is it his historical opinion that there was no violence before communism?
Well, and also that capitalism can abide socialism. I mean, if we look at the history, what the capitalist powers, especially the United States, well, before that, they've seemed to go out of their way to make sure that there's never like a working model of that. So, and the violence that's been utilized to make sure that anything socialist, proto-socialist, or communist gets off the ground, I think speaks for itself. But I want to hear what you have to say about any of that, in particular, how likely it would be if we look at the current development of the forces and relations of production in the sector and all, and the all of it. The idea that somehow what happened in the early days of the Soviet Union would be exactly what would happen in the United States if there was a dictator, if something approaching what gets talked about as the dictatorship of the proletariat, rather the dictatorship of capital, came to be take root in the United States. That Tad would have to be either shot or acquiesce to go to some factory or farm collective.
It's not really a serious question.
He thinks it is.
I don't see these things as being determined by ideology. They're determined by circumstances. It's like there's a lot of differences between Russia and the United States of America. I'm sure that would be your geographer's expert opinion.
Yeah. Well, that's why I thought it was so funny, because he was so adamant. Like, I keep on saying comrades. And first of all, Ben Burgess is a communist. Are you fucking kidding me?
Well,
in name only.
Like most Trotskyists, he pretends to support Lenin when he actually doesn't.
At best. He's a spicy liberal at best. Just like Tad. Go ahead. Sorry.
I actually like to go back to the comparison between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, which is where conservatives first make the break. And maybe, Tad doesn't, because he's against the American Revolution too, apparently. But conservatives say that there's a big ideological difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, but because there was a different outcome. But I would say there's a different outcome because there's vastly different circumstances between the U.S. and France, right? And the difference is that, like, France had an absolute monarchy, and the absolutist monarchy was on their soil, so they had to directly confront the king and his family. and in a civil war situation, like kill them unless they were going to renounce the prerogative to organize the counter-revolution, which they didn't. Whereas in the United States of America, the king and his family were off on a different continent. So to get themselves liberated, they didn't have to have direct confrontations with the head of state. It was much, much easier. So it wasn't actually an ideological difference. And again, you talk about the Illuminati. When the Federalists were saying that Jefferson was down with the Illuminati, they were only exaggerating a little bit, because Jefferson was asked in a private letter what he thought about the Illuminati. And he said, from what I read about them, they're pretty progressive. They're pretty cool. I support their opposition to absolutism and theocracy and mass education and secular education. I support all of that. So there was, you're talking about differences in revolutions or differences in political systems that are probably more circumstantial than they actually are ideological. Remember I was telling you about Benjamin Franklin and his son?
Yeah.
I was skulking around a used bookstore, and I found a whole book about Benjamin Franklin and his son called A Little Revenge. It's a nice big book too, and it's basically a dual biography of Benjamin Franklin and his son William. And it's incredible, but it has stuff in here about the persecution of the loyalists, right? The persecution of the loyalists was done by a committee of safety, which is the same name of the group that ran the Reign of Terror in France, right? And this historian, who's a rather actually established conservative historian, William Stern Randall, at one point refers to it as a reign of terror. Now, the story I told you before about what Benjamin Franklin did to his son was the royal governor of New Jersey. It's funny. He brought his son to be to England to be a barrister because Benjamin Franklin started off as a reformist, so he wanted to train his son to challenge the British in the legal system. But then when his son went to the fancy law school, he got sucked into he rubbed elbows with all these British aristocrats, and he became an Anglican. So he lost his son in his reformist plan, and then he becomes a hardcore revolutionary, and his son won't go along because now he's down with the royal system. And he just he approves his son being sent to solitary confinement for over 6 months, literally living in his own filth, isolated from his family. He was disappeared. His wife died of despair while he was in prison, and of harassment because she was constantly being terrorized by the Patriots, the Revolutionary Patriots. Let me read you an excerpt. Throughout this is when Philadelphia was captured by the British and then reclaimed by the Patriots. Throughout the occupation by the British, the rebel committees had secretly assembled lists. Now a blacklist of 490 names was published. Loyalists must either surrender and stand trial as traitors or have their properties confiscated and sold. Most chose to flee, leaving virtually everything behind. The gallows at Center Street in Philadelphia was kept busy in the autumn of 1778. 2 executions particularly shocked loyalists. Abraham Carlyle and John Roberts, both Quakers. They went after the Quakers because they didn't tolerate neutrals. The Quakers are pacifists. They refused to pledge allegiance to the new nation. And they traded with the British. Were condemned to die despite a plea for mercy from 380 citizens. 5 clergymen, and many of the leading revolutionaries even. But the Pennsylvania Council was unmoved. The councilors considered it necessary to terrorize the Quakers into submission. So there you go. Or as far as force, the use of force for liberty.
Yeah. Yeah, I just thought it was so funny because he really seems to think that's, and they just humming, and he's like, no, I'm saying I want, and it's just, I just thought it was good. It's a speculative thing, but the idea that it's very ahistorical, it's very, it's just, several fallacies going on there with that proclamation. And so, yeah, I just thought it was kind of hilarious because, yeah, there's no meaningful difference between, 1917 Russia and 2025 or 2024 United States of America.
Yeah, yeah.
And also, I think, again, there's the text, and then there's the universal, and then how it gets particularized in different times and spaces. But technically, when they say the means of they're against private ownership of the means of production, which doesn't mean you can't own anything.
Right.
And so how if there was a democratization, which he seems, I guess maybe is against that, a democratization of the organization of our production of goods and services, that somehow that equates forced collectivization of the way he thinks happened across the board in the Soviet Union, and that that's always where it leads, is kind of a bit, I guess Sutton-esque, I guess you could say.
Yeah. And it's kind of if you take the anti-communism out of it, it's kind of, I feel like it's kind of empty, or it's kind of like a philosophy of despair or inaction, that like we can complain about like this system that's over us now, but we can't do anything about it because doing something about it would involve violence, and that would make us no better than the enemy.
Or maybe infringe upon and maybe libertines wouldn't be able to do whatever floats their boat 24/7, and that would be, and that is terrible. I mean.
Well, yeah, I noticed he had a thing not just against force and authoritarianism. He's against self-discipline.
Yeah. I mean, it's I don't know. It just seems at the go ahead. You're
trying himself.
There's something going on with your volume.
I think I'm back.
Okay. Can you repeat what you wanted to say?
Is there?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
No, I just said in his book, A Renegade History of the U.S., he has a bit where he's sort of denouncing self-discipline, and these some of the reformers were against capital punishment, not capital punishment, corporal punishment of students, and they were proposing instilling self-discipline instead, and he was making it sound like this is just as bad or something. I don't know really understand where he's coming from. He's coming from, a very, very anarchist place, what Marxists would call the lumpen. But how do you run a society that way? I mean, this is what conservatives, not just conservatives, but just like what everybody ended up hating about the George Floyd protests, is that like they had no model for an alternative society. It was just like chaos, and it just degenerated into chaos and criminality.
It's having fun, man.
As many black people, young innocent black people got killed as white racists. It's just not it just doesn't work. All
right, so there we have it. So he would have to. So again, every week. So based on what we had from that clip of his, we can't take it too seriously, and it's just like I would agree that it's not really a serious question. But maybe we just don't know. Maybe there's more to it, because like I said, it's just, again, it's reductive in the extreme and commits the false cause fallacy, ignoring uneven history and geography of material conditions and political choices and a variety of other things. And I still would like to understand, or to flesh this out more, why he's so adamant that that's what would happen, unless he's just internalized because it confirms his bias. He has a certain story of communism, or any kind of centralized or collective authority, and Yeah, but somehow doesn't apply that to the current situation that he lives under. Perhaps because he has it pretty good, maybe, even though he didn't get tenure, he's having a pretty good time, I guess. So it seems like
Yeah,
it's
I
all
mean,
good. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Just
and what is the communist equivalent, to Zionism? It's like, when did the Russian or the Chinese send masses of their citizens, to a different continent to settle there, and displace displace the native population and refuse to draw borders, where that settlement was going to end, bringing them into constant conflict with the entire region. They've had wars on their borders, but those wars on their borders were largely instigated by the U.S. Jimmy Carter just died. In the left, the anti-war left, it's well known that Jimmy Carter secretly started funding the Afghan Mujahideen before the Soviets invaded, hoping that the Soviets would invade. Him and his national security advisor, Brzezinski, said that they wanted to give the Soviets their Vietnam. So it was their Vietnam in the sense that it was their quagmire, but it wasn't their Vietnam in the sense that they weren't going halfway around the world to fight a war. It was a security threat on their border, very similar to the security threat that the Ukraine represents to modern Russia.
Yeah, and also it's just this thing about being an anarcho-capitalist, but also anti-imperialist, because if capitalism is based on, requires growth, and so if you're going to intensify either the market or the commodification within a border, or you're going to extend the markets into other ones, that always comes up against people who don't like it. All that's solid melts into air, all that's sacred that's profane, and all the imperialist battles. And he wants to somehow, maybe that's why he's also so adamant on focusing on the ideology or the psychology of imperialism rather than the capitalism of it all. And also his broader take on the founding fathers and the imperialist, the problematic imperialism of the U.S. foreign policy, I guess, because it's just like how, I mean, there's violence built into capitalism,
right?
And it's not just, and Marx was quite clear on this, and others have fleshed it out. It's not just in the early days of so-called, the so-called primitive accumulation. So, I mean, the process of laying the foundation for the society that he thinks is, maybe the least worst one, it's in itself a violent process, and that's well established.
Yeah. Although the primitive accumulation history is
sorry, go ahead.
But the primitive accumulation itself is enough, because we're talking about the foundation of new communist societies. That was the foundation of the capitalist societies. Literally slavery and genocide. And someone here is commenting about communism equaling genocide and slavery. I'm sorry, those were around before communism.
Yes, they were.
And the level, everything indicates the level of, I don't know about genocide, but the level of innocent lives lost and enslavement is much less than that which preceded it. The worst famines in history were the ones that took place under the British Empire in India and in China in the late 19th century. In terms of the proportion of global population, the communist associated famines have never surpassed that. And communists fed more people than it starved. Under Stalin, the USSR, the Russian population topped 100 million for the first time. So the stereotypes don't hold up to the data.
Well, there's also this book, and I wish I had it. I can't remember the title of it. Is it The Tea Wars? Or anyway, it's historical economy, I guess. Yeah. And it's the premise of this book is that if you look in the 1800s, or no, the 1700s, and you look at India and China compared to Britain, and they're doing quite well. And then you fast forward, and then it's flipped. And looking at this through tea, basically,
Right.
and also the Opium Wars, this type of things. The idea that that wasn't a violent enterprise.
Yeah.
And somehow, if he wants to extract that out, which he probably has to pluck it out, he'd be like, "Well, no, that's not part and parcel of capitalism. Good luck," I would say to that. And it's only to make. It's not to say that there isn't violence or coercion or all kinds of things. Not to whitewash any history, but there is this tendency to measure with two different cups.
Oh, absolutely.
And that is the problem. Is if you want to have a measure about what, in terms of violence, in terms of coercion, in terms of everything, then you should apply them. You should apply them to both your capitalist society and actually existing socialism that's of the last 100 so years or so. And then fine. And then also, I think we want to bring in the importance of the forum of the realpolitik, in terms of, it wasn't just that everybody said, "Oh, great, look at this fantastic experiment that's going on in Russia. Let's just hang back and see what happens." I mean, do you want to talk a bit about that, about how to understand both the internal issues, but also the external threats that were going on that could account for some of the brutality or some of the not nicenesses of the Soviet Union, especially under the Stalin period?
Yeah, well,
before World War II.
Something that Sutton capitalizes on, especially, but really most anti-capitalists, anti-communists capitalize on, is whitewashing the history of the 20th century prior to communism. Like we talk a lot about,
great.
We talk about the bloody 20th century, and then people talk about that, and then they'll go right into Hitler and Stalin, and then they'll probably mention Lenin too, and the Russian Revolution, and try to fold Hitler into that. But the first mega death of the 20th century, and that's a scientific military term, mega death. I'm not talking about the metal dead. The first event that killed tens of millions of men, women, and children in the 20th century was World War I. It killed 40 million by the total estimates. That right there is more than Stalin, right? And it did it with famine. It did it with bullets. It did it with poison gas. In my alternative medical world, it's not even entirely alternative. I think one of the journal articles I showed you, they're talking about the influenza, the great influenza of 1918 is most likely directly connected to World War I. And the famines that come from the supply chain disruptions and the agricultural disruptions, and plus what poison gas does to your lungs and all of this. And this was a war that was started by capitalists who call themselves Christians, but nobody wants to talk about that. And that's the context for the Russian Revolution. And the Russian Revolution arguably helped end it, because it's Lenin who put out the decree for peace, saying that we need to have an international peace conference now. The fighting needs to end now. And if all the allies won't join me, Russia had been part of the Entente, as it's called, versus the Central Powers, which was Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. If they won't join me, then I will have a separate peace with Germany. But I would prefer that there's an international peace conference and an immediate ceasefire. That's what Lenin said. And he put that on the table. And that was a massive help to the anti-war movement. And, they denounce Lenin for sort of promoting this idea of, for promoting international revolution and all this stuff. But it's like, communist revolutionaries played a huge role in the German Revolution, November 1918, and that revolution, that collapse of the Kaiser in his war effort, was the decisive thing in the end of World War I.
Mm-hmm.
So indirectly, there's no question that Lenin helped end World War I. This meat grinder that was killing 40 million people, completely written out of our Western history.
Yeah. All right. Well, Garrett, we've been going for 2.5 hours. So, and I really appreciate it. I've learned a lot. It was one of those things I was thinking, like, why don't I know about the Sutton guy? And now I know a lot about him. So everyone, again, I want to plug your article here. Sorry. So now you can see I was feeling myself today when I was doing this. And I was thinking about that JC song for some reason. So if you're having ideological problems, I feel bad for you, son. I got 99 problems, but an anarchist ain't one. Anarcho-Capitalist ain't one. Of course, he would say a bitch ain't one, but I don't want to get too in there. Anywho, that's my fun for the day. So Covert Action Magazine. This came out on the 21st, 2025. It goes into a lot of detail. You really put a lot of work into that. So you're a serious person, Garrett. You can joke.
It was a slog too, because because I'm a conspiracy theorist too. So I don't want to.
Who doesn't love the truth is out there?
I don't want to fall in with the people who are all like, oh, these far right conspiracy theorists, and they're all.
It's not a conspiracy theory once if it's true.
Right. Yeah. And they're just talking their nonsense, and they're all anti-Semites and yada yada yada.
No.
There's also a lot of right populist conspiracy theorists who are frankly liars. And part of the reason I'm a dissident conspiracy theorist is because I don't like being lied to. So I'm as offended by being lied to by Antony Sutton as I am by MSNBC
or Fauci. In particular. Yeah. So anything you wanna say, or any besides buyer beware, or don't have to swallow things whole. And I do want to say we've been harsh on Bad Tad, but his programs are worth watching. But do keep in mind anything that has to do with anything collective or socialist or Marxist or communist. You should just be skeptical of the story he's of his worldview on that.
Yeah. I'd say, a lot of these journalists are cool, and sometimes, Tad and his anti-war positions are cool. But I just wonder if you're promoting this anti-communist ideology, it will eventually lead to a rationale for war. There's so many of these people who are opposed to the war on Ukraine who I think would jump for a war with China because they buy this narrative that China is the worst regime in the world and it's growing in power and it's eventually going to take over the world unless we confront it.
It's cheating us, and it's all this stuff. Those bad Chinese who let us shift into manufacturing over there.
Yeah.
How dare they? And then that's smart enough to orchestrate it to a way that would benefit them as well, bastards.
Yeah, anyway. And that's how the neoconservatives started, because that's the narrative they had about the Soviet Union.
Okay, Garrett, thank you very much. Let's see. I will play and after in our closing credits, I will put up your information on the Substack and also your X account, because he's a good follow. And I'm sure I hope that this is the first of not that I like there being bad takes, but my guess is we'll have the occasion to have another bad anarcho-capitalist take. With,
Well, I'm definitely gonna write another Sutton article because there's a lot more material. There's a lot more false
that sounds like it.
That could be found with his.
And also comparing him and Lindsay would be fun.
Yeah. Well, the whole like, you know, myths about the Hegelian dialectic. Yeah, that's a deep pit.
Okay. Do we have? Let's see. Yeah, I'll also play some of the comments after Garrett and I sign out or drop off the stream because it's getting pretty late here where I'm at. So, but you could also put if there's a burning comment or complaint or, you know, something you want to call us, you can also do that on X, of course, under that. All right. Thank you very much, Garrett. See you next time.
Thanks, Tara.
Bye. All right. So that was our friend of show, regular historical correspondent, Garrett. And do follow him and check out his Substack. The details to do that will be coming shortly. This has been another Morbid Symptoms. Please do like, share, subscribe. I'm on, let's see, X, and there is on Substack and Rumble and YouTube. Any support is appreciated with my little infant channel that I'm trying to grow. And if you have any suggestions for guests or topics, etc., please do let me know. I'm always keen on that. And on that note, we will see you. Actually, I have another show coming up, I should say, on tomorrow. We're having bad feminist takes with with Laura Jones. So that'll be around 7:30 UK time. But you can check on the X and whatnot. I'll be having the details on that. So on that note, I will see you all later. Take care. Keep hope alive. Good night.